His House is the latest Netflix original horror movie that first premiered at Sundance this year. And this movie is scary and creepy and chilling, but not your traditional horror sense, because it's not about the jump scares. It's not even about the monster, their pet, that makes the story so scary or chilling. It's the fact that this story is layered in a level of realism. It's the realism that actually brings forth the horror of this movie. And the plot twist of the movie adds to the level of the realism that actually makes us uncomfortable and makes this movie one of the better horror movies Netflix has distributed. But on this video, we're going to be looking mainly at our characters, Bol and Rial. If you guys have not seen His House, stop this video now because we're going to dive deep into spoilers. But I want to say something. Bol, the husband and the main character of His House, was right. What I mean by was right, the choices that he made, even though the consequences were dire, was the correct choice. Because we find ourselves following this couple from South Sudan, Bol and Rial. They escape South Sudan, traverse the Mediterranean, get to Europe, and find their way to England, where they ultimately get asylum or temporary asylum. And that is the typical immigrant story, especially with the turmoil going on in South Sudan, the horrors that they escaped, and overall the horrors of the African continent. You have a lot of immigrants fleeing their homeland and trying to make their way to Western countries for safety and security. It's when they get to England and they get their temporary asylum where the horrors actually start. Because they're given a house to live in, Rial and Bol, and they're given a weekly allowance. However, they're not allowed to work and they're not allowed to take extra income from anywhere else, automatically restricting their earning potential, but giving them a much reprieve from what's been happening in South Sudan. At first, we're not privy to exactly why they escaped. All we know is they're immigrants and we get bits and pieces of flashback. But after about a day of being in the house, they start to hear noises in the wall and they get haunted by their daughter, Nyagak. And throughout the movie, we see that the hauntings come out even more, and they're being haunted by an apath, which is a night witch. And the night witch is a sort of spirit that takes retribution for something that is stolen. And we come to find out that their daughter died. And as the movie progresses, Rial wants to go back to South Sudan, while Bol wants to adapt and forget about the past, and their haunting intensifies. And we come to find out that the path wants Bol to pay the ultimate price for what happened to his daughter if he wants her back. At this point, we find out the daughter died in a flashback while they're crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and that guilt has weighed on both their conscience. It's not until the major conflict between Rial and Bol happens where Rial wants to leave and Bol wants to stay and assimilate, because what they escaped was horrors beyond horrors, and he feels like if they burn the past and get rid of all their past belongings, they can actually leave the ghost of their daughter behind, as well as their past night witch. While all of this is happening, we get an uncomfortable dynamic between the couple, and we see that the haunting is more so their guilt manifested. But then we get the plot twist. And the plot twist is, while they were escaping South Sudan, they tried to get on a bus that would ferry them to safety, but the bus only allowed families and children along the bus. And we come to find out that Rial and Bol never had any kids, and Bol actually takes Nyagak, their daughter, from somebody else, and they get safe passage, while the mom is chasing the bus down. Nyagak's actual birth mom is chasing the bus, and Bol and Rial know what they did. And they use her as leverage to assert themselves safe passage out of Sudan. And once they leave and they're crossing the ocean and she falls over and dies, that is on their conscience. Not their daughter. She's not their daughter. But because the responsibility comes in, they took somebody else's daughter and that daughter died. And now that's weighing on their conscience. Now, at first we can look at Bol and say, hey, he kidnapped someone's daughter, he escaped, and now he's trying to forget about his crimes and assimilate to a new life in London, while Nyagak is dead and her actual mother is now childless. We could see it as selfish and self-serving. However, what this video is about is, let's look at the uncomfortable truth of this movie, because the horrors come from their actions. The horror comes from the fact that their guilt is eating them upside. However, there is a level of realism beyond just the original scares of this movie, and that realism comes from the fact that Bol did the right thing when he took Nyagak. Now, hear me out. Before y'all get on my case, listen to me. Hear me out. If Bol never kidnapped Nyagak in the first place, Bol would have died, Rial would have died, Nyagak would have died, and her birth mother would have died, because this was an uprising, a violent uprising, and they were killing women and pretty much everyone in their path during this clash. So by him taking Nyagak, that gives her another new leaf on life that allows her to escape the ravages of South Sudan And granted, I understand it's fucked up. You took someone's daughter from them, but you gave her a new life. And that is one of the most horrifying parts of this entire movie, is the fact that people are willing to do despicable things to escape their circumstances to make it to countries in the West, whether it's England, whether it's France, whether it's the United States. All these roads are littered with blood and death and kidnappings and killings. And while we have a creature called the Apath, the Night Witch, that actually haunts them, the Night Witch is not necessarily the scariest part. The scariest part is the fact that Bol had to do this in order for his wife to survive. He had to do this for his survival, and he did it for the girl's survival. Now, I understand the girl ends up drowning ultimately while they're crossing the sea, but no one could have actually predicted that, because had the girl lived and they made it to London, she would have been afforded a whole new life that she wasn't going to get being stuck in Sudan, because most likely she would have died while the uprising was happening. So while what Bol did was kind of fucked up, ultimately it was for the betterment of him, Rial, and Nyagak. So once he gets to England and he tries to assimilate and forget about South Sudan, and Rial wants to go back, we can understand her wanting to go back because she feels the guilt of it all, and she feels that the only way she can repay this guilt is she puts her life back in danger. But we have to understand, what's done is done. They're being haunted, and I have a striking suspicion that the Apath and all the creatures in the wall are not actually real, because no one else ever sees these ghosts. The movie, it's called His House. It's mainly because the story Rial tells Bol about the Apath and how it comes and haunts people's houses. But is it really real? Because no one else sees the Apath. No one else sees these creatures. Even when the caseworkers come to their house, they see the holes in the wall, but they never see any creatures. And that's because there might not be any creatures at all. I understand the creatures themselves are very real to both Bol and Rial, but that is their guilt ultimately eating away at them. That is their guilt actually, because they took someone's daughter and she died. That is on their hands. That is blood on their hands. Even though ultimately Bol was correct in his assertion to move and take the daughter with him, the fact that she died has to weigh on his conscience. And when he gets there, he's also right by saying, let's forget the past, forget everything. If they can overcome this guilt, they have a new lease on life where they're in the West and they actually survive the horrors of their home country. So of course he wants to put this behind them. So when he talks to the Apath and he asks what could he do, and he has to give his life for Nyagak's life, and the Apath starts to crawl under his skin and is trying to kill him in order to bring her back, we have to understand this. Nyagak is never coming back. So it's not necessarily a creature killing Bol. However, it is his own conscience, and that is driving him crazy. That is putting a wedge between him and his wife. That is causing him to want to kill himself in order to assuage his guilt. And when the Apath is killing Bol, it's at that moment Rial realizes that she's about to lose her husband, and she slits the Apath's throat. And that is her coming to grips with her husband is here, Nyagak is no longer here. They have to build a life together and move on. And once they kill the Apath together, once they essentially bury their guilt and move on and take a new lease on life, that's when they stop being haunted, and that's when they're able to move on and fully embrace their life as immigrants in the West, and they can actually try to stay in the country. And that as itself, as an ending, it's almost as horrifying as any other type of ending you can have in a horror movie. They don't really actually survive anything but their own guilt and the fact that they're okay with their actions. The bloody road led them there, and we even see at the end where they're surrounded by all the other people who died. All these people died so Bol and Rial can get to where they're going. So it's necessarily them embracing the fact that, hey, a lot of people died for us to get here, but their sacrifice will not be in vain, and we are the ones who survive. And that is scary in itself. That is creepy, because who knows how many immigrant stories actually turn out like this. How many bodies, how many people have died so certain immigrants can make it? They don't only have themselves to live for, they also have the burden of living for everyone who died so they can get here. So yes, Bol is right in the fact that they have to move on. They have to forget about the past in order for them to move forward, because the sacrifices that were made in their wake cannot go in vain. And that is the scariest part. Moving on when you know people have died and sacrificed themselves for you, and you are the ones who made it while they did not. Living with that survivor's guilt of, I made it here. We saw so much death and suffering, but I, Bol, my wife Rial, we made it to London. We have to live and we have to grow and continue our lives because of all the people in our wake. And that haunting realism is the true horror behind his house.